All right, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay.
All right, hello everybody. This is our first video webinar, so we're very excited to figure out how all of this works. So I want to welcome you all to our latest webinar in our JET Alumni webinar series and our last webinar in 2019. My name is Bahia Simons-Lane. I'm the Executive Director of U.S JET, the United States Japan Exchange and Teaching Program Alumni Association. We are a nonprofit organization that furthers the U.S.-Japan relationship by supporting alumni of the JET program. We provide resources for individual JET alumni and the 19 JET chapters nationwide. If you enjoy this webinar, please donate today for Giving Tuesday and become a member at usjeta.org. So today we have Harry Hill with us to talk about his path from coordinator of international relations to entrepreneur, his past and current business ventures, and advice for JET alumni interested in working in the Japanese business world after JET. Harry was a Mombusho English Fellow, precursor to JET, and CIR in Gifu-Ken from 1985 to 1988. Over the years, he's been involved in many business successes and has played an important role in supporting U.S.-Japan relations. I will be the moderator tonight. At the end of the webinar, we will take your questions, and you may type your questions anytime using the Q&A feature, which is usually at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what device you're using. Now, let's begin. Harry, could you briefly tell us how and why you ended up in Japan as a Mombusho English Fellow, the precursor to the JET program?
Hi, Bahia, and hello to everybody out in the JET world. I became involved in Japan in my freshman year at Cornell University. I was always interested in martial arts, and I was looking for a different martial art to try. And I was walking by a group that was practicing. There was Shorinji Kempo. And so my first interaction with Japan was by starting with martial art Shorinji Kempo in my freshman year. Subsequently, as I was thinking, initially I thought I was going to be a journalist or a diplomat, and I was preparing to study and really focusing on European studies. And in the summer between my sophomore and junior years, I started to really think about my future. And as I was reading the newspapers, the New York Times, and looking at what I thought was happening in the world, it became clear to me that the future of the world was really focused on Japan, where Japan was now, at the time, a huge growing economy, and Asia. And I looked around and I thought of the people that I knew around me, including my parents and many people I respected. Everybody was completely Eurocentric. And yet, it seemed to me that the future was really going to be in the Asia-Pacific region. And so that was when I made my decision to start studying Japanese. I started studying Japanese when I was a junior. And I really, during that summer, I made the decision to go to Japan. And I had this image that somehow or another I could become a bridge between Japan and the United States and prepare for that. And I didn't know how that was going to happen, because I actually really thought initially that I was going to get to journalism or foreign service. But that was where the idea started.
So I'm curious, as a follow-up, back then, I imagine that the Mombusho English Fellows program was not as well known as JET is today. How did you hear about the program?
I heard about the program from my Japanese professor. I was talking to my Japanese professor and told her my strong interest of going and working in Japan. And she suggested the Mombusho English Fellows program. My first year in 1985, I believe there were, I'm not exactly right, but I believe there were 49 MEFs for the whole country. So there was just slightly less MEFs than the number of Todofuken in Japan. And I was the only, of course, I was the only person in Gifu. And then in my third year, of course, there was like 200 people in Gifu. So I used to joke with them that it took 200 people to do what I used to do all by myself. I felt I was tremendously underpaid.
That's funny. So after your position as CIR, what did you do?
I was in Gifu for 3.5 years. The first 2 years as an MEF, and then the third year was the very first year of the JET program, and I was a CIR in Gifu. And that year they had a large regional exposition in Gifu, and so it was a great opportunity for me because I got out to go on the planning committee, and so I was working with them. They created a little international forum inside the expo. We had a couple of international events. One of the events was actually bringing a group of Native Americans from Arizona to show a Native American culture. And interestingly enough, there was a young congressman from Arizona who accompanied that trip, and that was John McCain. And he ended up staying in Gifu for a couple of days, and my bosses didn't know what to do with him, so they just sort of put me in charge of taking him around Gifu and showing him the different sites. Little did I know that he would later become such a famous person. So I did that for 3.5 years. And the great thing there is that, of course, with the expo, it was a joint private-public partnership. And I worked with a lot of the local Gifu, Chubu businesses. And that gave me a great network that I ultimately used in my future. But after 3.5 years, I got to be a little bit paranoid that I had lost my English and I had lost my sort of Americanness. So I was anxious to get back to the United States and try working in the United States. So I went back to New York and worked on Wall Street for 1.5 years. And that experience on Wall Street was really beneficial to me. I learned a lot, particularly something that as an entrepreneur helped me a lot was how not to be afraid of money. Because I was trading, I was a bond trader for a Japanese securities firm. And our minimum trades were $1 million. And we were typically trading anywhere from $500 million to $2 billion a day. And each tick was $10,000. And I remember, like in my first week, I made a mistake, and the mistake cost the company like $60,000, which was more than I was being paid at the time. And so it was a real good, I think, introduction into business life. And as I said, it taught me how to divorce myself from money in a way that you have to risk money in order to be able to do business. But after working for 1.5 years on Wall Street, what I learned is that was really not what I wanted to do. When I was in Gifu, I really felt that I was making a difference and sort of helping bridge between the cultural exchange between Japan and the United States. And when I was working on Wall Street, and there's nothing against Wall Street, and it's a great profession, being in the finance industry, but I felt that I was giving no value to society that I could feel proud of. And so I couldn't get up in the morning and feel passionate about what I was doing. So that was what drove me to resign my job at Yamaguchi Securities and go back to Japan.
So it's great to find out what you don't want to do. I think that's such an important lesson for all of us. Could you tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and your experience working with businesses in various sizes and stages? And please tell us about some of your biggest, most significant accomplishments over the years.
So after I came back to Japan, and I actually thought that I was going to be eminently employable. And this is actually a theme that I would share with my JET colleagues or my JET AA colleagues, in that Japan has changed significantly in the last 30 years. I thought that with my background in having worked successfully in obviously the Japanese government, public-private partnership, strong Japanese experience in business, I was a generalist, but I had certainly lots of skills. I thought that there would be many Japanese companies that would be interested in me. And pretty much nobody showed any interest in me. And the biggest reason that was given was that at the time, people considered hiring a non-Japanese person in a Japanese company a short-term hire. And I liken it to the skito in baseball. It's okay, you hire a talented baseball player. You don't expect them to be with the organization more than 2 to 4 years, but you expect to get great performance in that 2 to 4 years. And so at that time, what they were looking for in non-Japanese hires was a specific skill, but not Japan sort of awareness. And they had no expectation that you would become a long-term employee, which is interesting. Now, 30 years later, is completely the opposite. There's a huge interest in hiring Japan hands by Japanese firms because they see the need to have somebody, non-Japanese people who are going to work for the company for 10, 20, 15 years, or 10, 20, 30 years. But so I came back to Japan and realized that I wasn't really employable in what I wanted to do. And I had made the decision that I would never teach English again. But I felt that English was, and English is, I think, an important thing, but I also felt that there was really no upward mobility in teaching English. So I wanted to do something relative to a career. And that's when I started my first business. And if there's a theme that I have in terms of the various businesses I've started, I call it cultural arbitrage. And what I look at as cultural arbitrage is that I believe that, and I believe this passionately, that people are people, and that there's really, and back in the day there was a lot of talk, well, no, Japan, about the uniqueness of Japan, the Japanese that the intestines are different, the snow is different, I think what happened was that so many companies and services and brands tried to localize, over localize, and actually lost their uniqueness, lost what made them special. So I started focusing on just, okay, what were things that worked in somewhere, and usually in the United States, and was there an opportunity to bring that to Japan? And so some of the things that I've done that were sort of interesting is, in 1990, when I first came back to Japan, for example, sports agency was still outlawed in Japan. And I actually contacted several sports agents in the United States, and they hired me to represent them. So I was the agent of sports agents, helping to bring American baseball players to Japan. That was at the height of the bubble economy, and we got some very large contracts for pretty good minor league baseball players to play in Japan. I was able to, as I say, sports marketing was a burgeoning business here in Japan. So I was able to sort of build that from baseball to golf. I was able to do cultural exchange, helping to create sister city programs, and then working on the travel arrangements around that. The other thing at that time, Japan was heavily regulated for travel. And so I was able to kind of work around some of the regulations for travel. Because, for example, if JTB was doing a sister city program, and sending 50 people to the United States, they'd charge 500,000 yen for a 10-day trip. And I went in and that was when it was a very closed market and very controlled. And I started going in and realizing that the sum didn't equal the parts, and I was able to kind of work around and do charters and essentially create my own unlicensed travel business, but still legal by using different facades. But I could, if JTB was offering something for 500,000 yen, I could undercut it by 100,000 yen per person and still make 100,000 yen per person of profit. So it was, and so for a while there, I had a business where I was maybe taking 1,500 to 2,000 people a year from Japan to the United States. But so it was an interesting business. But when travel got liberalized I think it was 1995, essentially that was the end of my business. But that was sort of how I got my feet wet. That was also the first business that I did an M&A transaction for. I sold that business for 10 million yen, which at the time seemed like a lot of money. In the meantime, I had created relocation services company that in 1990, there was a huge amount of expats moving from the United States to Nagoya because of all the joint ventures between the aerospace companies, so Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, created that company. That company we turned into a very, very good, profitable company. That was the second company that I sold. I sold that for about $3.5 million. In that period of time, I became involved with Oakland Marketing, and Oakland Marketing essentially created the infomercial business in Japan. And I was not the founder, but I joined in 1999, and I became president in 2005. In the time that I was president, from 2005 to 2017, we grew sales from about $150 million a year to $700 million a year. We sold a little over 50% of that company to NTT Docomo. We got over a $600 million valuation. So it's kind of an interesting thing. As the entrepreneur, I've run one-person companies. I've run 1,000-person companies. I've had one employee myself to 1,000. I've sales from $250,000 a year to $600-700 million a year. In fact, just last week, I did my fourth. It looks like I'm part of the principal of my fourth sort of major M&A deal, which is a data platform company that I created in conjunction with NTT Docomo to help them monetize their data. So what I've done is, but all of those ideas came from looking for something that was successful in the United States and saying, why couldn't that work in Japan? And particularly obviously with Oakland Marketing, Shop Japan, TV shopping, we were the first company to in the late 1990s, from midnight to 5 o'clock in the morning, Japanese TV went dark, which is exactly what used to happen in the United States. And it took us a long time, but we convinced the TV companies to let us try to air infomercials during that period of time. It was interesting what they told us. That's silly. Nobody watches TV at that time. And we're saying, well, all you're showing is static. Of course, nobody's watching TV. But essentially, that changed the shape of Japanese television. We were the first company to do a 30-day money-back guarantee. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is fitness. And essentially, we created the home fitness market in Japan. Some of our products have been some of the best-selling hit products in the history of Japan in terms of home fitness. So, but again, all of those things, when we started home fitness in Japan, people told us nobody works out at home. And we're saying, what makes a Japanese person who's concerned about living longer, feeling better, looking good, any different from somebody in the United States or Europe? And again, so our sort of focus on this cultural arbitrage, saying if it's works somewhere because people are people. And my main focus has always been on the consumer market. I believe that if it works somewhere, then there's a question of how to tell the story correctly in Japanese, but that it will work here.
Okay, you've given us a whole lot to think about. So could you tell us about any new business ventures you're involved with? I know last time we talked, you mentioned something kind of related to fitness that you're working on right now.
Yes. So actually, as I stepped down as the CEO of Oakland Marketing and Shop Japan at the end of 2017, and pretty much spent 2018 doing two things. One is helping create this data marketing platform, this data platform, this new company that we created with Docomo, and then also making sure that the transition from myself to the next person at Oakland Marketing Shop Japan, the next leader, worked out well. And then I started looking, okay, what makes me passionate? And I kind of came back that there were sort of four things that I'm really passionate about. I was offered several jobs leading companies sort of in the B2B world, and I realized that while I've done B2B and I enjoy it, and it didn't make me just jump out of bed in the morning, and that what I'm really more focused on and more passionate about the B2C, the business, the consumer side of businesses rather than the B2B. Then the second, and then the other things I realized is that there were sort of three themes that I had in my life that I wanted sort of, now is an opportunity for me to not only make new businesses and make some money, but also to give back. And one, of course, is my family, but beyond family, having spent the last 34 years here in Japan, and I have, and seeing other families, I feel that there's a real crisis of family values in Japan right now. And when I talk about family values, I mean, there's all sorts of ways that we can talk about family values. But to me, the most important role of a mother or a father is to give their child opportunities and dreams. And I think that so many people of my generation, Japanese people of my generation who grew up after the bubble, have become, we're so demoralized by the bubble that the current crop of younger people are, I think, under-inspired. And you hear this a lot in the Japanese news. Well, kids today aren't, they're not as interested in international things. They're not as adventurous. They're not as ambitious. And and I'm not even sure that's not necessarily accurate anyway. But if there's a problem, I don't think it's a problem with the young people. It's a problem with the old people. And so one of the things that I want to work on is this idea of how families can support each other and communicate better. So that's one of my themes. Second theme, of course, has been, I've always been involved in martial arts and fitness. And of course, to be honest, I mean, while I've had several successful businesses in Japan, the most successful thing that I've done is really created this, is when we worked on creating, essentially a $500 million home fitness industry where it didn't exist before. So not only is it something that I'm passionate about, but it's rewarded me tremendously. So again, I wanted to go back and sort of think about, okay, how can I, focus and make a contribution in the fitness and the martial arts world. And finally, as you know, and I came here originally as an English teacher, and education is important to me, and it sort of it links to the things that we've been talking about. And when I look at education, I look at the idea of how can we inspire people? And when I first came 30 years ago, I saw so many young people who were wanted to learn English because they wanted to experience the world. And so give people the idea that, okay, get back into focusing and promoting education and English and as a means for opportunity. So those are sort of my four themes. In that, I've created a new company called Better You. And the first thing that we're working on is we've got the franchise rights for the UFC gyms in Japan. And what's interesting is my initial thought when UFC gym approached me about representing them, I was like, well, Fight Club, I'm not so sure. But when I actually went and visited the UFC gyms, they have a very strong message. And their messages are pretty threefold. One is the UFC athletes are the best athletes in the world, and you can condition like the UFC athletes. That's message number one. Message number two is you can gain sort of martial arts skills. But message number three, which was what really intrigued me, was that it's the most family, that their goal is to become the most family-friendly fitness club in the world. And actually, those three messages is what they've taken, not only and worked on in the United States, but outside of the United States, and it's been very effective. And family-focused fitness is something that doesn't exist in Japan. And so I'm now partnering with the guys who brought Gold's Gym to Japan, and we're working on family and fitness. But then the other aspect to that is we did a lot of market research with our core target group, which is really families with children under the age of 12. And they talked about wanting to have a place where they could condition and learn English in the same location. And so we were going to be opening up the first integrated fitness and education studios in Japan, with the first one hopefully opening up in April of next year. And one final aside is that one of the people who's working with me on creating the pedagogy and the English curriculum that's going to be used inside of our gyms is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Charles Brown, who coincidentally or ironically arrived with me on the same day in 1985. And so he was a jet with me, or excuse me, an MEF when I first came, and he was the first chairman of AJET in 1987. And he's become kind of a world famous researcher on language acquisition and particularly on words.
That is really cool. I think one of the sayings that I hear a lot in the JET network is, jets are everywhere. I keep in U.S. Japan relations especially, but not just that, in education everywhere, people kind of come out of the woodworks. So that's really interesting. I want to slightly change our focus a little bit. I know that we have a lot of alumni who are interested in working in Japan after they leave JET, and you did talk a little bit about that at the beginning, but what advice would you give those JET alumni who want to stay in Japan or return to Japan and work in the corporate sector?
Well, I think there are numerous opportunities in the corporate sector in Japan right now, both for working at multinational firms as well as working at Japanese firms. Now, Japanese firms have a crisis in that if you're looking at a mid to a large Japanese firm, they already know that there's a demographic crisis in Japan. There's not enough people. There's more jobs than people. But that demographic crisis not only results in not having enough people to work, but it means that the markets in Japan are going to decrease, so that companies that want to grow have to look outside of Japan. And so that really means that there's a whole new array of opportunities for people who want to come into a Japanese company and have the ability to sort of work within a Japanese culture, but also work in other cultures, being the bridge or being the leader of operations to work on foreign expansion, exports, etc. So there's certainly a huge opportunity in that respect. Now, the downside of that is that's maybe working in a Japanese company in a Japanese environment, but it might not necessarily mean that you're working in Japan. It might mean that you're working in Singapore, Southeast Asia, or going back and forth. But there's certainly real opportunities in that respect. There's also, of course, multinational companies that are increasingly looking for non-Japanese talent who have, who are fluent or able to live and work in Japan. And there's, particularly from the reason is that both Japanese and companies, as well as multinational companies, are looking for more critical thinkers. And typically the Japanese education system, while it is training people to be with great amount of skills, particularly in math and science, but critical thinking has been something that they've always had difficulty with. And more companies are now putting an emphasis on trying to hire people with critical thinking skills and leadership skills, and saying we can teach some of the intricacies of Japanese culture later. So certainly for mid to larger companies, both multinationals and Japanese companies, there's plenty of opportunities. In terms of where those opportunities are, most of those opportunities are going to exist in the 3 major metropolitan areas, and particularly in Tokyo and Osaka.
Great, thank you for that. I'm sure that'll be helpful to our audience. Before I move on to the next topic, I just want to remind our listeners that we will be taking questions from the audience at the end. So you may type those into the Q&A function at any time during this if you think of a question that you'd like to ask and you don't want to forget. All right, so Harry, I know you've been really, really active in promoting U.S.-Japan relations through many different organizations and in many different capacities. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about those organizations and how you've been engaged in the efforts that they are making to support U.S.-Japan relations?
Well, since January of 2014, I've been the co-chair of COLCON, which is the Council for Cultural and Educational Interchange. It's very difficult. I don't know how that turns into COLCON either, but which was a organization that was started, inspired by John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Ikeda in 1961, with the express mandate that true friendship between nations starts with people-to-people exchange, particularly educational and cultural exchange. It's a bi-national group. It meets every other year, and we make recommendations to both the Japanese and U.S. governments as to how, essentially, to shine a light on different grassroots organizations and different ways that there can be more exchange and between our two nations, and particularly focusing on the next generation of leaders, whether it's in education, culture, arts, sports, etc. I've also been working with the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission, and by virtue of being appointed, being co-chair of COLCON, I was also the chair of the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission, which also, 12 extraordinarily talented panelists from a variety of fields. But one of the important things that we've been doing is that we manage a grant giving, and that every year we give away anywhere from $1.5 million to $2 million or so of grants, again, to really focus on the next generation and building, making sure that there's a strong basis of grassroots exchange between Japan and the United States. Some of the things that we've done is including helping smaller liberal arts college or smaller colleges or historically Black colleges develop programs of exchange and between Japan and the United States. We've had a group. We've been supporting a group of congressional exchange, which is, essentially creating that generation of congressional leaders who become friends on both sides of the Pacific. We've been supporting that for over 30 years. So the idea is this is a more of a people-to-people type focus, which is near and dear to my heart, rather than sort of an institutional structural focus. And from Japan U.S. Friendship Commission to COLCON, that's very rewarding work, and something that it's easy to look at and think that you understand that we're making a difference.
Great, and of course, I have to say thank you to the Commission on the behalf of USJA, because JUSFC has been a supporter of ours for a while, and we really appreciate that support getting our organization going into where it is today. So,
and if you think about it, I mean, and I look at it and for all of us who were on the JET program, I think we have tremendous. We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to the Japanese government. I think the JET program has been by far one of the most successful cultural diplomacy programs that I can think of. And if you think about, if one of the ideas was to create a large network of friends of Japan who will go back to their home countries throughout the world, and you start at a young age and will stay involved in Japan on a friendship level, JET has been tremendously successful. What it wasn't successful at is really improving Japanese English education, which is something that I hope that we can, all of us can help work at it in the future, because that's something that I would like to get back to Japan.
Yes, well, I think we could have a whole nother hour or two long conversation on that topic. So I'm just going to skip right by it onto our next one.
We'll focus on the cultural diplomacy side.
Yeah, so I'd like to know, why are you involved in this work? I know you spoke about it a little bit, but, explicitly, people-to-people exchange is important to you. Why is it so important?
So, one, I think there's a little bit of, there's some karma involved. And, I've been a tremendous beneficiary of people's generosity in both, in spirit and in giving, and in opportunity. And so certainly I think that there's part of that is as over time you have a responsibility to give back. But that's actually, that sounds really good, and it's certainly part of what drives me. But the other thing is, there's a whole part of it's enlightened self-interest. What I find is when I meet like-minded people with like-minded values, opportunities come out. And so when there's nothing, there's no, you don't have to put yourself in a bottle. Well, I'm doing something, I'm doing CSR work, or I'm doing something that's socially responsible. I can't look for the business opportunity there. In fact, while the business opportunity may be tangential and not direct, what I found is that in so many of these different types of organizations that I'm involved with, the people that are engaged with me are the people who become future business partners, friends, business partners, areas where I can find opportunity. So, I believe that that's the way the world should work, in this sort of virtuous circle of people creating opportunities, giving opportunities, and then finding new opportunities. That's of course that, because I guess I'm as being an entrepreneur and being somebody who's sort of has this core belief in the power of the individual. It's been very easy for me to be involved with these different organizations, because I just see so many different. Well, one, it's rewarding to see the different exchanges take place, but then I find the people who I'm interacting with, I'm learning from, and becoming friends with, and then ultimately I'm seeing opportunity.
Great. So you're also interested in work that helps people around the world, not just in Japan. I believe one of your new projects has been the Hope International Development Agency, Japan. Could you tell us?
Actually, that's not such a new project.
Okay. Well, one of your projects. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
So, Hope Development Agency Japan was developed as an offshoot of a Canadian NPO, and a gentleman who was one of the founders of Hope was married to a woman who had grown up in Nagoya, and we became friends. And Hope now has been, we started Hope in 2000. So Hope, we've been involved for 19 years. I've been on the board for a number of those years. I was chairman of the board for 8 years. But the main focus of Hope is on providing clean water to the neediest of the needy, and having spent time in Cambodia, Somalia, Ethiopia, some of the areas where we've helped to dig wells, and then you start with wells to education to irrigation to schools. The difference essentially between giving people the opportunity to have live like human beings versus barely able to scrape by is really the difference of clean water. And so we've been working, and we've been digging wells and water systems in the different countries where we do business, or where we help for over 19 years. We were the first foreign-run NPO to be in Nagoya to be recognized as for charitable conduct, as a authorized NPOs. We can actually we can be a charitable deduction. The MOFA, the Ministry of Finance, has recognized us as for the excellence of people-to-people sort of help. And so they have a certain budget that they give every year that's focused not on typically what MOFA is giving is big infrastructure projects, but really on purely focused on the kind of people to people type giving, where changing a well typically change the lives of 5 families or something like that. And we've been receiving between $600,000 and $700,000 a year from MOFA to distribute into different projects. So again, it comes back to a theme that I have, which is on self-reliance. And the other thing, part of what we're doing is it's a message that we're spreading to a lot of our Japanese colleagues and friends, is that typically in Japan, the idea of giving, that's something that companies do, or you give to nameless, I don't want to say nameless organizations, but you give to big organizations, and you really have no idea of how your giving is making a difference. And we're saying, no, actually, you can have the ability to really, on an almost personal level, give, and that what you give makes a difference. And it doesn't have to be that much. And we're getting, we have young people who are getting involved, people who are giving 1,000 yen, 2,000 yen a month to, people who are giving something more significant. But it's a message of self-reliance, and it's a message of all of us, whether it's big or small, can make a difference.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's great to hear about the mission of that organization. So before we take questions from the audience, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
So, as an entrepreneur, and people often ask me, what does it take to be an entrepreneur? And I think there's different things. My personal thought has always been about this cultural arbitrage, and that my belief is that entrepreneurs rarely are the people who create something new. What entrepreneurs are really good at is finding something and being the first to monetize it, and being the first to turn it into a business. And there are different ways to do that. And as I say, I think there's so much in the world out there that you can look at and say, wow, that's really cool. Why isn't it Japan? Or what that's in Japan, why is that not in the United States? I go back to when I first came here, people would always ask me, can you eat sushi? And if you think about that, and of course that was always about polite, but if you think about the idea that question in and of itself is a decidedly non-entrepreneurial question. Because if sushi is such a unique and wonderful culinary asset, then people should have been jumping at the opportunity to say, how can we bring sushi outside of Japan? And the interesting thing, of course, is that sushi, the people who have really made sushi popular outside of Japan have generally not been Japanese people. And I believe Jetro even did a study of the 20,000 Japanese restaurants in the United States. Less than 30% of them are run by Japanese people. So one I would say is there's this opportunity for, as an entrepreneur, to be cultural arbitrage. And the second thing I always talk about is indulge your passions. You can't be an entrepreneur unless you're absolutely passionate about what you're doing. Because being an entrepreneur is a 24/7 job. And so you have to be absolutely believe it, absolutely passionate about it, because you need to be able, 24/7, you don't necessarily have to work 24/7, but you have to be ready to work 24/7. And the last thing I would say about being an entrepreneur, and I always say this, you need to not be afraid of zero. Every entrepreneur fails. And generally, I think the numbers say that 90% of new businesses fail. And the opportunity, the great thing about entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs have the ability to look at that and say, how do I build from there? And so you have to have that mindset that failure is okay, and that if you do fail, that's not a comment on you as a person, as a human being, or even on your abilities. That there's part of that there, and then you look at that saying, how do you turn failure into success? So my last thoughts on that.
No, that's awesome. Awesome last thought. So, I'd like to open up Q&A time to the participants. If you have any questions, I haven't seen any come in yet, but please feel free to type them in. Oh, great. One just came in from Anthony. He asks, I'd love to hear what, if any, challenges you've experienced as an entrepreneur within the Japanese regulatory environment. Which of your enterprises were official businesses registered within Japan? Which were registered elsewhere? And how does that affect your ability to operate in Japan? Can you tell us a little bit about how simple or complex those regulations were and how you navigated them?
Wow, what a terrific question. And so as I mentioned, you know, for my first couple of ventures were actually sort of on the fringes, on the gray area of the Japanese regulatory world. And you know that, you know, when I was in the gray area, there was great opportunities, but things at any time, like when all of a sudden travel, the regulations on how you could be on travel agencies and how you could do travel, when that changed, that essentially you know, took away my business. You know, that I could answer that question in great length, because having been working particularly on the direct marketing side, on TV shopping side, there was tremendous amounts of regulation, tremendous amounts of interchange with the Japanese authorities. And one of the things that's sort of interesting about Japan, and it's interesting and frustrating about Japan, is that generally speaking, Japanese regulations are very gray. And I always liken it to, since I think everybody here has been in Japan, the speed limit. If you drive on a Japanese highway, a lot of times the speed limit is 80 to 100 kilometers, and nobody is obeying the speed limit. I mean, when somebody's obeying the speed limit, it's unusual. And if you and this is actually, I think, something that's generally true in Japan, is that regulations tend to be a little fuzzy, because at any time, if the Japanese authorities want to look at somebody and squeeze a little bit, they have the opportunity to do so. I think that's certainly what happened with Carlos Ghosn and the whole Nissan saga. I've had that issue many, many times on the advertising side. For example, in theory, there's no comparative advertising allowed in Japan, but actually there's nothing in the law that says that. But we've gone back and forth with regulators, you know, over and over the years, as to what could be or not be considered comparative advertising. A couple of years ago, we got hit with a marketing cease and desist order. And again, what was amazing to me is it was clearly we had created a hit product in a ceramic frying pan, and we went from essentially having 0 market share to 7% of the frying pan market share in Japan in less than 12 months. And we were then hit with we were given they came in with the FTC, the Japanese Fair Trade Commission, came in with a very, very detailed audit of what we were doing. And the interesting thing is that they went through this whole audit, and they came in, and it was clear that there was no way that they had done all the research. So somebody had supplied them with all the research that came in to do the audit. Now, which is, so as they were doing the audit, what was interesting to me was, so they went through the whole thing, and in that whole process of the audit, we were able to answer every single question perfectly. And then the funny thing is that at the end of the audit process, we noticed that we had made a mistake in one of the things we had said, it said part of our marketing campaign. Now, in the part that the mistake we made didn't affect the safety or the quality of the product, but it was technically a mistake. And now the interesting is they had not asked us about that. So then my staff came to me and said, we found that we actually, so after we answered all these questions and then the process of answering, we found out we did say something wrong, but they didn't ask us about this. So what should we do? But so what I did was I said, well, let's disclose. So we disclosed it to the FTC. So they would not have found it if we hadn't disclosed it to them. If we hadn't said, you know what, in this process, we found this. In that process, what I did is I took the show that we were running, I took it off the air, I fixed it, and then started it again. 1 year later, they came out with a cease and desist ruling against us on something that we had already stopped marketing. And even if they said they gave us no penalties, and they said, and it didn't affect the quality or health and safety, but it was wrong. But in Japan, if the government puts out a warning like that, it essentially renders the product unmarketable, unsellable. So they, 1 year later, they came and hit us. Clearly, that was instigated by something sort of behind the scenes wanting to protect a certain industry. That's the sort of things where, so when you say regulatory issues in Japan is really important. Having that relationship with the regulators is really important. The one thing that will never happen in Japan, if you ask them, is this okay? They will never say yes. The only thing that will happen is they sometimes will say no. Anything they say no to, you shouldn't do. But just because they don't say no doesn't mean yes. And you will never get a yes. And I could talk about that for a long time, but I think that in some ways that's sort of some of the feudal nature of Japan that still exists today, is that when the authorities always want to have something that they can possibly do if they want to. Look, almost every politician who ever steps out of line, all of a sudden they find that they've had a campaign finance infraction, and they get reprimanded every single time. And it's not because are they that stupid? But I think what really comes down to, it's like the speed limit. When the law, when there's so much gray, at some point you can always say, well, we're gonna hit you this time. Of course, you can go way over the speed limit, then you don't have to. Then that's that's a different discussion.
Right. Well, Anthony says in the comments, that's a tremendous answer, Harry. Thanks so much. Anthony, I'm glad we were able to answer your question. So we're almost out of time. If there are any pressing questions from the attendees, ask them now. I'm going to just ask you briefly, Harry, you were telling me you have a beautiful view out your window that we cannot see. Could you describe the view for us?
Well, if you look out from there, I can see Tokyo Tower, Roppongi Hills, Midtown. It's all right, sort of in my living room window.
That's awesome.
Beautiful, and it's a beautiful day.
Well, thank you so much for being with us here tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time. For the people who are, viewing and listening, I would love some feedback. This is a new format for us, doing a video webinar in this interview style format. So I'd love to know what you think of it, if you liked it. This is also a different time slot for us because Harry's in Japan and I'm here in Washington, D.C. So please weigh in on that. Before we leave, I would also like to let you all know we have a program with the East-West Center in Washington, D.C. For author contributors. So if you're a JET alumni who is listening and you're a writer and you'd like to contribute, Please check out our website for more detail on that. The abstracts and writing samples are due on December 10th, so please, think about submitting. We'd love to hear from you. The East-West Center will give selected authors $250 stipend towards the publication of your work, so it's a great opportunity for aspiring authors. I would also like to remind you all that if you're not a member and you haven't donated to USJA for Giving Tuesday, please do so. Please think of us. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Harry, for being here. We really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day in Tokyo, and
Thank you.
we'll enjoy our evening here in Washington, D.C.